Most of the time people are not evil, especially as individuals, but gather people together in between group dynamics, opportunism, and a sense of diffused moral responsibility. The odds of bad things happening increase. Following are 20 things about otherwise innocent groups and companies that started off good, or at least neutral before turning to evil. Number 20. The assassins transformed innocent young men into highly trained terrorists. The Order of Assassins' first notable victim was Nizam al-Mulk, a Grand Vizier in the Seljuk Empire. He wielded absolute power for 20 years, before the assassins got him in 1092. During their centuries of operations, the cult's suicide squads killed many prominent Middle Eastern figures. Their victims included numerous sultans, viziers, generals, crusader higher-ups including a king of Jerusalem, and at least 2 caliphs. In his youth, King Edward I of England was grievously wounded, and barely survived an attack from an assassin, who snuck into the royal tent when Edward was on crusade. The assassins took innocent young men and turned them into suicide killers. However, unlike modern suicide bombers, the assassins' killers were carefully selected and well-trained in combat and disguises. Aside from the requisite physical fitness, they had to be quick-thinking, well-read, intelligent, patient, calculating, and cold. They also had to possess charisma, in order to infiltrate their opponent's defenses, and gain access to and come within striking distance of their target. Number 19. The assassins were early pioneers of propaganda of the deed. The assassins were early believers in and practitioners of propaganda of the deed. Spectacular political acts, in this case political murders, meant to serve as examples for others, and as catalysts for further events whenever possible. The assassins did not settle for simply murdering their victims. Instead, they sought to kill them in as dramatic and public a manner as possible, especially when it came to targets who had enveloped themselves in the heaviest layers of protective security. By killing their victims, some of them innocent, some not so much, in public, in front of as many horrified witnesses as possible, the assassins advertised their cult's reach. They also struck fear into the hearts of leading men by fostering the perception that those targeted by the assassins were dead men walking, no matter the precautions taken. Number 18. This cult's killers went to great pains to properly plan and execute their murders. Order of Assassins killer squads usually planned their hits carefully. They began with studying the routines of a targeted leader, then they laid in wait for him during a heavily attended public event, such as a festival or Friday prayers at the mosque. At a signal given at an opportune moment, they would spring into action to stab and slash their victim, while shouting the name of their cult's leader, and whatever offense the victim had given. Stories abound of assassin sleepers, outwardly innocent of guile, who spent years diligently working their way up the ranks, and into the inner circle of a given court. There, they would patiently await instructions that might take decades to arrive, if ever. In some instances, a victim would discover during the final moments of his life that one, or more of his bodyguard were assassins cultists. Number 17. Instead of murder, the assassins sometimes relied on intimidation. The assassins did not always kill their targets. Sometimes the cultists turned to intimidation instead of murder, such as with the Seljuk Sultan Sanyar, who had rebuffed ambassadors from the cult. He changed his mind after waking up one morning, to find a note pinned to the ground near his bed by a dagger. The note informed the Sultan that if the assassins had wished him ill, the dagger stuck into the hard ground could have easily been stuck into his soft breast instead. The message was received loud and clear. Peace reigned between the Seljuks and the assassins for decades. During that stretch, the old man of the mountain was paid protection money, face-savingly described as a pension, and he was permitted to collect tolls from travelers passing near his fortresses. Number 16. The assassins even managed to scare off the Middle East's most famous figure. The most famous Order of Assassins target to be intimidated instead of murdered was Saladin, leader of the revived Islamic resistance against the Crusades. After retaking Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187, Saladin marched on the assassins, who had murdered his predecessor, and sought to end the cult once and for all. However, while encamped with his army near the assassins' holdfasts, in the mountains of northern Syria, Saladin awoke in his tent one morning to discover that the cultists had bypassed all his bodyguards and layers of protection. They left a menacing letter pinned to his pillow by a poisoned dagger, advising the Sultan that they could kill him whenever and wherever they wanted. Saladin turned his army around, abandoned the campaign, and sent officials to negotiate an understanding with the current old man of the mountain. Via such means, a grudging live and let live relationship developed between the assassins and the region's powers. Number 15. The scary assassins finally encountered enemies who were even scarier, the Mongols. The Order of Assassins was finally destroyed by the Mongols when they overran the region in the 1250s. The Mongols were an alien people from far away, with no connections to the Middle East. Their leaders were not surrounded by Middle Eastern courtiers, but by their own kind in armed and highly mobile camps in which strangers conspicuously stood out, that neutralized the assassins' tactics of patient infiltration and blending in, which had worked so well in a region they knew and whose peoples they understood. Such tactics were useless against the Mongols, whom they neither knew nor understood, and whose ranks they had neither the means nor time to infiltrate. The Mongols appeared too suddenly, acted too swiftly, and were too alien for the assassins to get a handle on them, or work out strategies and tactics for getting to their leadership. The Mongols' bloodthirstiness, savagery, speed of action and reaction, and lack of interest in negotiations, was beyond anything the assassins had ever experienced. Number 14. The Mongols reduced the assassins from terrifying to but a tale on men's lips. In the run-up to their invasion of the Middle East, the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, began attacking and seizing assassin fortresses. As a preliminary to his conquest of the region, Hulagu took a detour in 1256 to storm the cult's strongholds in Persia. He captured the last old man of the mountain, and forced him to order the remaining assassin fortresses in Persia to surrender. 40 of them, including the main fortress of Alamut Castle, did so, and the Mongols razed them to the ground. Hulagu then sent the old man of the mountain in chains to the Grand Khan in Mongolia, who had him executed. The Mongols then slaughtered all whom they could lay their hands on of the Nizari cult, to which the assassins belonged, along with their families. It was a thorough bloodletting that broke the assassins' power for good. It reduced the cultists, according to a contemporary historian, to but a tale on men's lips and a tradition in the world. Number 13. The Order of Assassins withered and vanished into history. Remnants of the assassins survived in Syria, which lay outside the Mongols' control. Eventually, the Egyptian Mamelukes first reduced them to vassalage in the 1260s, and finally forced them to surrender their last fortresses in 1273. The last cult members were allowed to live, kept on retainer as contract killers. However, their independence was forever gone. In that final phase of existence as contract killers, the steadily dwindling cult existed for a few decades more. It survived, at least in name, into the following century, before vanishing into the mists of history. Number 12. BMW was once up to its neck in collaborating with the Nazis. Ever since its founding, Bavarian Motor Works has been known for high-quality luxury automobiles, and until 1945 for aircraft engines. The company, which today makes a living off the innocent pursuit of manufacturing luxury cars and motorcycles, is a multinational with plants in Germany, the US, UK, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. Less known is that its major shareholders, the Quandt family, were close friends and admirers of Hitler and the Nazis. After a 2007 TV documentary aired unpleasant revelations about BMW's activities during the Third Reich, the Quandt family launched an investigation which reached troubling conclusion about the company's Nazi past. In a nutshell, the Quandt family patriarch Gunther Quandt and his son Herbert were up to their necks in collaborating with Hitler's regime. To their credit, the current generation of Quandts, unlike many other companies with Nazi ties, eventually came clean and refrained from ducking the issue or sugarcoating things. They commissioned a respected German historian to research the company's past, and set him loose on BMW's and the Quandt family's archives and files. Number 11. BMW's chief shareholders were linked inseparably with the crimes of the Nazis. The result of the study commissioned by the Quandt family was a 1,200-page report, which concluded that the Quandts were linked inseparably with the crimes of the Nazis. The family patriarch was part of the regime. Among other things, the Quandts profited from the Nazis' Aryanization program, which dispossessed Jews of their property and turned it over to Germans approved by the new regime. Taking advantage of their friendship with Hitler and their excellent Nazi connections, BMW's owners took over dozens of businesses that were seized from Jews and handed over to the Quandts. So instrumental was BMW and the Quandts to the Third Reich's military that Hitler named Gunther Quandt a leader of the defense economy. During World War II, at least 50,000 slave workers from concentration camps toiled in BMW and Quandt family enterprises to manufacture weapons and fulfill armaments contracts. Many of them died from the inhumane working conditions, some from avoidable accidents, some from neglect, some were starved, and others were executed for workplace infractions. Number 10. The terrorist organization that started off as an innocent charity. South America does not usually come to mind when people think of World War II, nor does it often conjure images of fanatical Japanese, refusing to accept that their country had been defeated. However, South America's biggest country, Brazil, witnessed just that during the war and in the years after its conclusion. The country was shaken by fanatical Japanese immigrants, who formed a group that waged a campaign of terror against other immigrants deemed disloyal to Japan. After the war ended in Japan's surrender, the group's definition of disloyalty came to include the mere utterance of the fact that Japan had surrendered. Ironically, Brazil's Japanese terrorist organization, Shindo Renmei, League of the Way of Emperor's Subjects, began as an innocent charity. Number 9. From innocent origins to not at all innocent fanatical terrorism. Shindo Renmei was neither the sole nor first organization founded by Japanese immigrants to Brazil. All such organizations, with the notable exception of Shindo Renmei, were innocent entities that were formed to offer mutual support for the Japanese Brazilian community. One such was PIA, a charity founded by Japanese Catholics, with the approval of both the Catholic Church and Brazil's government, to help the poor Japanese immigrants. One of PIA's more active members was a former Japanese Army colonel, Junji Kakawa. In 1942, violent clashes erupted between Japanese immigrants and local Brazilians. That led Colonel Kakawa to split from the innocent PIA and form the not at all innocent Shindo Renmei, which urged Japanese Brazilians to engage in sabotage that began a dive down a rabbit hole of crazy that terrified Kakawa's fellow immigrants and bewildered and alarmed Brazil and the Brazilian government. Number 8. Japan's surrender in World War II shocked the Japanese and led many into extreme denial. During World War II, Japan fought tooth and nail, despite that the conflict ended in abject defeat, with the country forced to throw in the towel and surrender in 1945. The shock of defeat sent many Japanese into paroxysms of grief, and quite a few around the bend and into denialism, for them especially for those outside the country, who did not get to see with their own eyes enemy troops occupying Japan. News of the surrender was fake news. Most eventually came to their senses and accepted reality. Many, however, persisted in resisting facts. Thus, thousands of Japanese soldiers in isolated locales around the former Japanese Empire kept on fighting, for months, years, or even decades. Some were innocent cut-off troops, who had not gotten the memo. Others were just stubborn jerks. In Brazil, which hosted a sizable Japanese immigrant community, a radical group sprang up to terrorize people into denying that Japan had surrendered. Number 7. Brazil has long hosted the largest Japanese population outside of Japan. Brazil hosts the largest Japanese population outside of Japan, with over 1.5 million nationals or naturals of Japanese ancestry living there. Significant numbers of Japanese began arriving in Brazil early in the 20th century. By 1940, the country had about 250,000 Japanese immigrants and their descendants. Most were concentrated in the coffee plantation region in the state of São Paulo. Nearly all of them were hard workers, engaged in the innocent pursuit of creating a better life for themselves and their families. However, assimilation was difficult. Brazil was a completely different country with a different language, religion, customs, climate, and food, so quite a few reacted by becoming hyper-Japanese, embracing their birth country's traditions, mores, and nationalism, with a fervor exceeding that of those actually living in Japan. In the 1930s, Brazil's government embarked on a course of forced assimilation, which effectively banned Japanese language media. Since many Japanese could not speak Portuguese, they were effectively cut off from news beyond their immediate immigrant community. Number 6. During World War II, the Japanese Brazilian community was cut off from news of the outside world. Brazil joined the Allies in 1942 and declared war on Japan. That deepened the isolation of the country's Japanese immigrants. All communication with Japan was severed, and no new Japanese were admitted. The immigrants' radios were confiscated. Those living in the more urban coastal areas, where access to news was easy, were expelled and relocated to the more rural interior, where access to news was quite limited. Cut off from the outside world and reliable news, Brazil's Japanese immigrant community became ripe for, and ready recipients of unreliable news. As a result, many were hurled headfirst into a world of alternative facts, one in which Japan was winning World War II. By the time the war ended in 1945, many Japanese Brazilians innocent of the world beyond a small circle were exceptionally vulnerable to bad information. They sincerely believed that Japan had won the war. Those who disagreed or said any different were in for rough, at times lethally rough treatment. Number 5. The League of the Way of the Emperor's Subjects sprang from innocent roots. In 1942, violent clashes erupted between native Brazilians in rural Sao Paulo and the Japanese immigrants in the vicinity, so former Japanese Army Colonel Junji Kakawa left an innocent Catholic charity, in which he had been active, to found Shindo Renmei as a self-defense organization for Japanese immigrants. Kakawa urged his followers to protest their mistreatment, with steps such as ceasing the production of peppermint, which included ingredients used in making explosives, and to stop making silk, a vital wartime material for making parachutes. He also advocated more direct steps such as sabotage. By 1945, Shindo Renmei had a headquarters in Sao Paulo and 64 branches in Brazilian localities with Japanese immigrant communities. Number 4. Innocent Japanese Brazilians were led to believe that Japan was winning the war. During World War II, Shindo Renmei took a turn towards ultranationalism. With most Japanese Brazilians cut off from reliable news, Colonel Kakawa and his followers stepped in to exploit their innocent countrymen. They filled the information vacuum with news that amounted to little more than wishful thinking. As Japan reeled from defeat after defeat, Shindo Renmei told the Japanese immigrants that Japan was marching from triumph to triumph. The claims included a decisive Japanese victory in Okinawa, where America lost 400 warships. Victory was secured in no small part by a Japanese superweapon, a high-frequency bomb, which killed Americans by the hundreds of thousands, and forced the Allies' unconditional surrender. Many believed that, or if they did not, they knew better than to say so, if for no other reason than that Shindo Renmei also took it upon itself to punish defeatists in the Japanese immigrant community. Those who voiced doubts about how well the war was going for Japan were shunned, boycotted, and sometimes violently assailed. Number 3. Shindo Renmei convinced Brazil's Japanese that America lost World War II. Shindo Renmei dismissed Japan's surrender as fake news and American propaganda, and redoubled its efforts to punish those who said otherwise. According to Colonel Kakawa and his followers, Japanese immigrants were divided into two camps, good guys and bad guys. There were the virtuous Kashigumi, victorious, who knew that Japan had won the war. They were mostly the poor and poorly educated. Then there were the vile Makegumi, defeatists, also pejoratively labeled dirty hearts, who bought the fake news about Japan's defeat. The latter tended to be the better off and better educated immigrants, who had better access to information, and could differentiate between reliable and unreliable news. However, even those innocent of Shindo Renmei's fanaticism were terrorized into towing the group's line, or at least into staying silent. Number 2. Purveyors of fake news and charlatans exploited innocent Japanese Brazilians. By the time World War II ended, Shindo Renmei had about 50,000 followers. They went on a buying spree that emptied local shops of red and white cloth to make Japanese flags, intended to welcome Brazil's new overlords. The situation was further complicated by the circulation of fake Japanese newspapers and magazines peddled by charlatans. The fake media included articles about Japan's great victory, the arrival of Japanese occupation troops in America, photographs of President Truman bowing to Emperor Hirohito, and coverage of the trial of General Douglas MacArthur for war crimes. The charlatans did not do it just for kicks and giggles. They made a bundle selling the duped innocent Japanese immigrants land in the conquered territories. Number 1. Shindo Renmei launched a terror campaign against innocent civilians. Those who dared doubt Shindo Renmei's assertions of Japan's victory were beaten up or murdered. By the time it was over, dozens had been killed. In 1946, Japan's new government prepared documents for distribution in Brazil, outlining reality and declaring that Japan had surrendered. Shindo Renmei dismissed that as fake news and beat up or murdered Japanese immigrants caught reading or distributing the documents. To reduce the violence, Brazil's government prohibited newspapers from publishing news of Japan's defeat and ordered the term unconditional surrender removed from official communications. Things then gradually simmered down. A last gasp occurred in 1950, when Japan's Olympic swimming team visited Brazil. When its members expressed shock at the idea that Japan had won the war, diehards claimed that the athletes were actually Koreans masquerading as Japanese. That was so ludicrous that it eroded Shindo Renmei's last remaining support, and the organization soon vanished into history's dustbin.